Archie, as much as I love working with you, I really do want to retire young.
Well, Jimmy, there's a few roadblocks that you're going to have to watch out for. I'm Archie Hoxton.
And I'm Rob Hoxton.
And this is Last Paycheck, weekly wisdom to help you retire and stay that way. Welcome back to the Last Paycheck Podcast, brought to you by Hoxton Planning and Management. We're your hosts, Archie Hoxton and Jimmy Sutch. And today, we're going to talk about kind of an exciting topic, early retirement. But we're going to talk about the challenges, because I think that there is, maybe sort of a common misconception that early retirement is, roughly the same type of planning as a traditional retirement. But there are some substantial challenges that come with it. And it really requires a pretty long runway. You kind of have to decide pretty early on that that's what you want to do and dedicate a lot of planning and a lot of dollars and a lot of energy towards it.
Yeah, and I have a younger brother named Caleb who is in college. And every time I talk to him, he tells me how he's going to retire at 40 years old. And I said, there's a few things we should discuss before you make that your plan. But nonetheless, it does require much more money, and you don't necessarily have the time. And it's a big component. Time is the biggest component to all of this, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Time and compounding. So that's like the first one I would say is in order to retire earlier, you need more money to do it. You need a bigger nest egg, because you're going to be retired for a lot longer than a traditional retirement. If you retire at 65, which is kind of the traditional retirement age, default age, you're not going to be retired for as long, right? If you lived to 95, that's 30 years. And then you're going to have more resources at your disposal, like Social Security. You're already going to be eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and we'll get into that. But so you don't really need as much money.
And one of the things we had talked about a lot, and you hear a lot about, is the 4% rule, which we did a recent podcast about. But the 4% rule is a study where you can pull 4% of your assets, right? And they're always your assets will always outlive you for 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? And you think about retiring young, and I'll just use 45 as young, right?
Yeah.
Well, 30 years would only get you to 75. Right.
Right.
So that's not getting you to the end of the game.
Right.
And so even the 4% rule and those rules of thumb are impacted based on when you retire, right? And your time frame and longevity and all of that. So
you really can't rely on a rule that was, the study was conducted for 30 years when you want to be retired for maybe 40 or 50 years.
Right.
It's a whole different animal.
Right.
You've also got a longer period that your expenses are going to inflate. So how are you going to make sure that your dollars outpace inflation over a 40 or 50-year period? Accounting for the possibility of periods of higher inflation, there's a lot more risk, and that risk is decreased if you have more and more money. But you have to kind of reset your expectations about, what the right dollar and what the right amount of money to get to by retirement age is going to be.
Yeah, and another big challenge, right, is the short period. If you do retire young, the short period that you do work, oftentimes people are saving in qualified retirement accounts.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's a lot of restrictions when accessing those accounts, because Uncle Sam says, hey, Jimmy, hey, Archie, I know I can't afford to take care of you when you're 65 years old. Please save for those years.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of fork all this money over and save, while you're working. But then those accounts with the highest amount of money that you've accumulated are restricted.
Yeah.
Right. Until a later stage in life. So there's this enormous gap that's sometimes really, really tough to cover.
And so like if you want to retire at 45.
Right.
There's about 15 years, because it's 59 and a half is the magic age when those accounts become available without penalty. Now you can access those funds, but it's going to cost you another 10% on top of taxes. But that 15-year period, you have to figure out where that money is going to come from. And if all you've done is save into your 401k and IRAs and retirement accounts, one, the likelihood that you'll have enough, given the limits that are set on your annual contributions, the likelihood you'll have enough by 45 is probably pretty low just in those accounts. But then you have to have a strategy to access that sooner, which there are some. You can employ 72T distributions, which are distributions from a 401k or IRA that are not penalized because they follow a specific set of rules, like substantially equal payments over the period that you need them. Roth conversion ladders. We can't really get into these different strategies today, but there are ways. I would say the better way to plan, though, is to make sure that you're building a brokerage account, taxable money that you can access anytime.
Yeah. Another tough piece to it, right, is, oftentimes coming out of school or, the years where you're getting, married or having children, you're oftentimes purchasing your first home, which is an enormous expense. And so oftentimes, the first 20 years of working, a lot of your net worth is tied to an illiquid asset, which is your primary residence.
Right.
It's not producing any income. If you retire or stop working, it's not necessarily going to, produce or supplement any type of earnings.
Yeah.
So that's another challenge. A lot of your net worth is tied up in an illiquid asset.
And you're probably paying on it for 30 years.
Exactly.
If you buy it at 30, you're going to have that mortgage until you're 60. And so you've got to be able to retire and still pay your mortgage when, if you're retiring early, expenses and control over your expenses is critical to success.
And that's all probably manageable. I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Archie, but probably the biggest barrier to retiring young is most likely the worry of healthcare.
Yeah.
Right? It continues to increase in cost, and you're not quite at the age, not even close to the age of Medicare. And oftentimes people get health insurance, affordable health insurance through their employer. Right. So that's typically, we see that as a huge barrier to, these younger folks hanging up their cleats or retiring young.
Yeah, because you've got to go probably get one of the Affordable Care Act insurance policies, and those are expensive. The inflation rate, the rate they increase year over year is pretty high.
Yeah.
And so it's a difficult to control expense. It's really high. It's also really important.
Mm-hmm. I did read the average cost of health insurance for a 50-year-old is around $700 or $800 per month.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a big expense, and it's also an expense, that continues to increase.
Yeah.
Even though your income might not be as high as it once was.
Yeah. Now, Medicare is generally, depending on the plans you select, is generally a pretty affordable way of getting health care. Now, it depends because it varies based on income and lots of factors, but, you got to get to that point where you can enroll there. And, depending on how early you retire, that time period that you're going to be paying huge expenses for this healthcare is going to be long. And again, it's just higher expenses for longer that are potentially growing faster than the typical rate of inflation.
But those are so those are a lot of the things that make it really, really hard. But let's say we are pretty good planners. What are some of the things we're doing with our clients to help them prepare for this if this is really a goal?
Yeah. I mean, one, you have to have a withdrawal strategy that is tested against lots of different possible market outcomes.
Right.
You have to be willing to be really dynamic with how you spend money, because the earlier you retire, the more significant the effect of the sequence of returns that you get. Or in other words, the possibility that early on in your retirement, you have a really, really bad bear market that comes along, and you still need to take money out of your portfolio during that period, and that's going to affect the longevity of your portfolio. And the earlier you retire, the earlier that happens, the bigger that risk the bigger the risk that poses to the longevity of your assets.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that sometimes you don't necessarily think about, and not a lot of people necessarily encourage, but, if this is really a goal, do you find it appropriate to sometimes encourage people to say, hey, there is going to be a huge gap between the age of 45 and 65 when your, Social Security turns on? You might encourage folks to, hey, focus on saving in a taxable brokerage account, which provides additional liquidity. It'll help us bridge that gap until you turn on Social Security. There's really no penalties we have to worry about.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to take into consideration like the longevity and that gap that they have to cover.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, most people, I would say most people who want to retire early, it's more like 60 or 62. And that gap is shorter, and you can cover it with a brokerage account. You can also cover it with IRAs and things like that. But it's a few years. So making sure that you have something to cover that gap that's not going to penalize you, that still gives you flexibility is really important. Right. You're also, there's going to be a much, much larger responsibility to plan and make really good decisions along the way, because your margin of error is so much smaller. Right. And, for example, if you're leaving your job and you haven't prepared, it might appear that you could, you can retire comfortably for the rest of your life, but things can happen. Financial events can come up. You could have something that happens in the markets that affects your outlook that maybe you don't really realize the effect until you're like 60 or 64, 65. And then you're like, well, now I can't really get back into the workforce very easily.
And over a 40 or 50 year time horizon, like your priorities and objectives change.
Yeah.
Like your main goal might just be stay retired, but as you age, maybe you're really worried about long-term care events, right? Because that could really upset the apple cart, and that there's an additional cost to covering that. But it's really hard to project. I think the biggest component and challenge for us as planners is that it's really hard to project these things over 50 years, which is a life in itself.
Yeah.
Right? Or even 40 years.
It's longer than most people's entire career.
So the variance of outcomes and changes over a 40 or 50 year retirement are just so great that it's really, really hard to plan for that. Even if you are planning, very, very detailed, but
you don't have your most valuable asset, your ability to earn income from your labor, working for you to smooth out your results over time and keep you afloat. You're really you're fully exposed to all of those changes and risks that come along.
Yeah, another piece that is we don't often talk about, but if you want to retire young, you're often giving up your peak earning years.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to retire at 50 or 45 or 55, that 10-year window is oftentimes where you have the most cash flow.
Yeah.
Right? The most discretionary money where you can take it and you can save it for the future.
Right.
But you're actually divorcing yourself from those years.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sword that cuts on both sides, right? You're no longer having that higher income to save more. And then you're also distributing assets 10 years prior than you would otherwise.
Yeah. Well, if you picture too, I mean, those are also your peak saving years.
Right.
So like if your lifestyle increases roughly at the rate of inflation, which requires some self-control, but your income increases more over time, that's all of that, that period between like 45 and 65 is when you make the largest contributions to your nest egg. You're giving those up.
Right.
So you got to make up for it early on.
Right.
And, or cut way, way back on what you spend.
Right.
I think the other piece of this is figuring out what you'll do.
Mm-hmm.
that's a challenge for traditional retirement because,
regardless of age.
Regardless of age, if you retire at 65, you still have to figure out what you're going to do with your time because maybe you live 30 years and maybe 10 of those years, you've got plenty of energy to do all kinds of interesting things. But you've got to figure out what you're going to do with that time and recognize that like a lot of your purpose and social interaction and general sense of, busy and productivity comes from your work.
Right.
So where are you going to find that when you stop working?
Right. It's interesting, right, too, because even if you do find that purpose or that enjoyment that drives you and makes you get out of bed early, you beat your alarm every day, even in retirement, whatever that thing is normally costs money too.
Yeah.
Right. So you have more free time. You have more time to do things you enjoy. Those things that you enjoy typically cost you money rather than make you money.
Right.
Right. So it's I don't know, it's a delicate line, right?
Yeah. Like if you, whatever it may be, if you want to, spend your retirement.
Like I would love to get paid to golf or fish, but I don't think that's good. I think that's going to be a liability, not an asset.
Yeah. Yeah. And different, maybe it's like collect cars, you better have a monster nest egg because that's an expensive thing.
Of course.
A lot of people will have something that, does bring in a little bit of money and either just sort of pays for the fun thing that they're doing or maybe even creates some surplus income.
Yeah, we do see actually, regardless of age and when people retire, it's not uncommon for us to see people, retire gradually, right? So they slow down and then it's, 60% of their income and then 40% of their income. And, it's over a period of time, rather than all at once.
I think that's a great way to do it because you don't have this sudden shock of, I've got, a total lifestyle change. I've got nothing to do because most of what I was doing was happening at work. And you've got this window where it is tempting to kind of just, especially if your work was hard and kind of wearing you out, to just sort of like veg out. But it's important not to drift into that because that is also where you start to see people decline in their mental and physical health more rapidly. When you lose that busyness that, not necessarily, running hard all day long like you might at work, but something to keep you active and keep your mind focused.
Right. And we often don't get to these points very often because, Archie really, really wanted to retire young too, but then he told me he was expecting another child, and I said, no mas. So,
yeah. And then he took me through this podcast idea and showed me why I couldn't retire early. No, but it is definitely attainable. We know people who've done it,
of course,
but there are some big challenges that you've got to address way before you come to that crossroads. So. Anyway, we could probably keep talking about this for another 20 or 30 minutes, but we've basically run out of time. So we hope this was enjoyable to you, and we hope that you'll like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications so you know when we release new content, and leave us a comment with your thoughts. We love to hear from you all, and we're starting to share this content through the form of different resources. So reach out to us if you want any access to any of that. But anyway, we'll look forward to seeing you next time. You've been watching Last Paycheck, weekly wisdom to help you retire and stay that way. If you like this show, be sure to hit like and subscribe. Last Paycheck is available anywhere you get your podcasts.